For decades, Formula One fans have watched in frustration as one driver trapped another in their wake, unable to overtake, lap after lap, powerless to pass. The problem seemed almost unsolvable. You could be faster, you could be braver, but if the car ahead had the slightest advantage in clean air, you were simply stuck. Close racing became processional, excitement drained away. Then in 2011, the sport introduced something radical. A flap on the rear wing that could open like a mouth, just for a moment, just when you needed it most. And suddenly, the game changed. This is the story of how a simple hydraulic actuator and a pair of hinged plates became one of the most transformative and most contentious technologies in modern racing. How aerodynamics, fairness, and the very meaning of a Grand Prix were forced to reckon with three letters: DRS. We begin on a circuit in southern Spain, on a day when the governing body decided that Formula One's passing problem had become a crisis that demanded a solution. At Jerez in 2010, the conversation among the sport's engineers and officials had become urgent, almost desperate. The data was undeniable. Over the previous seasons, overtakes had dwindled. The number of lead changes in a race had fallen to historic lows. Drivers were faster than ever, their machinery more precise, yet, paradoxically, the racing had become duller. The culprit was aerodynamics itself. Modern Formula One cars generated so much downforce, so much grip, that they created an invisible wall of turbulent air behind them. A pursuing driver, no matter how skilled, would lose crucial tenths of a second in that disturbed air. Their tyres wouldn't bite as hard, their front wing wouldn't generate the same load. They were, quite literally, driving through their rival's exhaust. Something had to give. And so the engineers asked a question that seemed almost heretical. What if we let the car in front become less efficient? What if we gave the car behind a moment of pure, unadulterated speed? The answer emerged quietly at first. A movable flap. A rectangular slot in the rear wing that could be opened by the driver behind when conditions allowed it. When open, the flap would reduce drag dramatically. Suddenly the car would be faster in a straight line. It was simple, brilliant, and utterly transformative. But nothing in Formula One is ever simple. Nothing ever arrives without consequence. The first time a driver activated DRS in anger was at Melbourne in March of 2011. Jenson Button, then defending world champion, was trailing Sebastian Vettel's Red Bull. The flap opened, the drag vanished, and suddenly, impossibly, Button was alongside. The crowd roared. Television producers everywhere felt their ratings lift. This, at last, was the racing people had craved. But the governing body knew they had unleashed something they couldn't fully control. DRS could only be used when a following driver was within 1 second of the car ahead. A safety margin designed to ensure it wasn't pure gimmickry, that there had to be genuine pace in the car behind. Yet even with that restriction, some victories seemed handed rather than earned. Some overtakes felt theatrical rather than real. The engineers had solved the passing problem. What they hadn't solved was whether they should have. Teams began to ask themselves a dangerous question. If DRS gave such a dramatic advantage, then surely every moment of the car's design, every ounce of its fuel load, every strategic decision in a pit stop now had to account for this single technology. The entire sport had tilted. And yet as the season progressed, something unexpected happened. The racing didn't become artificial. It became complicated. It became real in a new way. Drivers had to judge not just when to deploy DRS, but how to defend against it, when to run a wider line, when to brake earlier, when to trust in something older than any aerodynamic formula. The courage to take a different corner entry and disrupt their opponent's rhythm. By the middle of that first season, a new tactical language had emerged. Teams were building their entire strategy around DRS deployment zones. Some circuits favoured the trailing car, circuits with long straights where the drag reduction meant everything. Others favoured the leader, where a defending driver could position their car, use the rumble strips, deny the clean air that DRS required to work. The sport had not been simplified, it had been deepened. And then came the political question that no one had asked loudly enough at Jerez. Was this racing, Or was this theatre dressed up as racing? The traditionalists were apoplectic. They saw DRS as a sticking plaster on a fundamentally broken sport, a band-aid where fundamental redesign was needed. The futurists argued that racing had never been pure. Slipstreaming had always been a tool. Fuel strategy had always shaped the narrative. Tyres had always failed at crucial moments. DRS was simply the next evolution. What neither side could deny was this: the television audience knew something had changed. Overtakes were happening again. Drivers lower in the field had genuine opportunities to move forward. The race wasn't decided on the first lap, locked in by aerodynamic superiority and tyre strategy alone. But as drivers wheeled their cars back to the paddock after that first explosive season, they understood something that the broadcasters and engineers and officials were only beginning to grasp. DRS hadn't solved the racing problem. It had revealed a deeper truth. In Formula One, every solution creates new problems, and every answer raises new questions about what racing truly means. By the end of 2011, the debate had shifted entirely. It was no longer whether DRS worked, the data proved it did. The question now was whether a sport that needed a mechanical button to manufacture overtaking had somehow lost its way. Yet the numbers told a fascinating story. Races with multiple DRS zones saw overtakes increase by orders of magnitude. Drivers who would have finished 15th now finished 6th. Championships that had been decided by summer were suddenly alive in autumn. The audience was watching races again, not processions. And in the middle of all this, something quietly remarkable occurred. The drivers adapted. They didn't just use DRS. They weaponized it, deployed it strategically, sometimes even held it back, waiting for the moment when their opponent least expected to see that rear wing flap open on the straight ahead. Lap after lap, race after race, a new vocabulary of attack and defense was being written in real time. DRS had intended to solve a problem. Instead, it had created something far more complex and, in many ways, far more interesting. It had forced the sport to ask itself, finally and urgently, what it actually wanted to be. As the 2011 season wore on, something profound began to shift beneath the surface of Formula One. DRS wasn't just changing who could pass whom, it was changing how drivers thought about racing itself, moment by moment, corner by corner, lap by lap. A driver approaching a DRS zone now faced a cascade of decisions that hadn't existed the year before. Deploy it too early and lose the battery charge for the next straight. Hold it back and risk being outdragged by a rival already gaining momentum. Time it perfectly and you might slip past 3 cars in a single session. But the most cunning drivers understood something deeper still. DRS could be used as a weapon of psychology as much as physics. Fernando Alonso learned to position his car just outside the DRS activation window, making a pursuer waste the advantage on the wrong piece of track. Lewis Hamilton discovered that sometimes not deploying DRS at all, saving it for a corner where it would surprise an opponent, was worth more than using it immediately. Teams began hiring specialists, strategists whose entire job was to compute DRS scenarios, building laptops full of data about which drivers activated on the straight, which braked earlier to reset their battery, which saved their allocation for the final lap of the race. What had started as a solution to a problem had become something far stranger and more human, a new art form. Racing had always been about reading your opponent, about patience and timing, and the willingness to take a calculated risk. DRS hadn't diminished that. Paradoxically, it had amplified it, because now every driver on the grid had access to the same tool. What separated the champions from the rest was knowing when and when not to use it. By October of 2011, as the championship reached its climax, the sport finally understood what it had done. DRS had never been about making racing easier. It had made racing harder, smarter, and infinitely more demanding.